Today's map is this beautiful airline route map from 1953. The DC-7 in the picture is the state-of-the-art, a 4-engine airplane capable of flying coast to coast in a single hop. And American Airlines is leading the country into a stratospheric future. Yet, there's something about this map that's more 19th century than jet age. I see it here. I see it here. I see it here. And I definitely see it here. This doesn't look like an airline. This looks like a railway. So what's going on? This is the sort of thing we love to investigate on the Eye of History. It's all about maps here. We look at both the history of the map and the history on the map. And if you enjoy seeing the world from new and interesting vantages, then like, share, and subscribe. It really helps niche channels like this one. The first true airline in America was Aeromarine West Indies Airways, which in 1920 began ferrying passengers to points around the Atlantic and the Caribbean, places like Miami, Key West, Nassau, Havana, and Atlantic City. There weren't a lot of airports back then, so Aeromarine used flying boats, like the Aeromarine 75 and the Curtiss HS-2L. The concept grew, and it was soon flying as far as Chicago, using Lake Michigan as an airport. In 1925, the U.S. government began contracting for airmail service, and the airline era truly began. Passenger service is risky. The popularity of any given route could fluctuate wildly from weekday to weekday and through the seasons. Airmail provided a stable income stream. In business slang, the airline could make its nut with the mail service and then make a good profit on whatever passenger seats they could sell. It didn't take long for the government to realize that some oversight was going to be necessary, if for no other reason than to establish safety standards. But the only model the government had was the railroads. This is one of the most important things you never learned in history class. The father of all government regulatory bureaucracy was the railroad. It was railroad crashes that inspired the first safety regulatory bureaucracy. One-off laws just wouldn't cut it, of course. It was railroad monopolies that inspired the first antitrust regulatory bureaucracy. Without it, strong railroads could slash prices to drive their competitors out, and then, with competition removed, raise prices without limit. And it was railroad infrastructure that inspired the first commercial standards bodies. Railroad signals were among the very first commercial standards written in the modern way. So if you understand the history of the railroad well, you will understand history better than 99% of the faculty of any Ivy League university. Because you'll understand how it all fits together. Progress, politics, finance, regulation, investment. Needless to say, I have a few very interesting railroad maps in my collection, and we'll be making videos on the subject to be sure. Admittedly, flights at this time were a lot like a rail trip. Airplanes had to hop from city to city. Until 1930 that there's the first non-stop service between Chicago and New York, the two biggest cities in America. And that was in a twin-engine Boeing 247 that could only carry 10 passengers. As a result, airline timetables were almost exactly like railroad timetables. In 1938, the Civil Aviation Board was created to regulate airlines and was all but a clone of the main rail regulator, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Just like railroads in the ICC, airlines needed CAB approval to start a new route or abandon an existing route. They needed approval for their ticket prices, even for special offers like holiday rates. Sometimes the CAB subsidized routes as well, but rates were always based on distance, not on demand. Our map was created just 15 years after the CAB, and we're going to see just what kind of impact the Civil Aviation Board had on the development of the airlines. Even if aviation was regulated like railroads, would that really affect all that much? Well, let's look to the map for the evidence. Even in the rapidly growing American Southwest, where one would expect to find the newest, most modern routes, we see railroads in the air. I showed you some other examples at the introduction to the video. These lines used planes that were designed for hopping. Small planes like the Convair 240, which sat just 40 passengers and cruised at 10 to 20,000 feet. Bigger planes existed, but they took much more fuel to reach altitude. Understand that on short hops, the climbing alone can account for half the fuel used on the entire trip. And this is an important thing to understand about aviation. Much of the hype today about high-speed rail ignores this fact. But when cruising, modern airplanes are much more energy efficient than any train. Think about it for a moment. The plane is far lighter, has zero rolling resistance, and minimal wind resistance. It can also utilize tailwinds for more than half the time, which trains cannot. It's only in the climb that trains have the advantage, and even then only in level terrain. So for short hauls, a train can beat an airplane for efficiency, but for long hauls, the airplane wins. Today, the break-even point is between 500 and 1,000 miles, depending on how mountainous the terrain. But in 1953, regulators were oblivious to the costs of hopping. In fact, they encouraged hopping by subsidizing stops like, well, this one in Douglas, Arizona. Population 10,000. Every day, 2 planes stopped there, one from each direction, mostly to deliver the mail, however much there might be in Little Douglas. There's another inefficiency hidden in these routes. There are always too many empty seats. Consider a typical run from LA to Dallas. Our little Convair starts with a full load, we hope, of 40 passengers. It reaches Phoenix, and we imagine a good number get off. We'll say 15. Now, some get on, but logically, we would expect that more people travel from LA to Phoenix than from Phoenix to Dallas. So instead of 15, maybe we get 5 or 10. So now the plane's no longer full. The same happens in Tucson and probably El Paso, and the plane gets emptier and emptier. As we get closer to Dallas, the reverse occurs and the plane starts to get more full. But for much of the trip, the plane operates well below capacity. Trains dealt with this problem as well, but trains could add or remove cars when necessary. Airplanes can't. Even after new planes came available, like the DC-7 we see in the cartouche, the route structure did not change. The DC-7 could travel over 3,000 miles without refueling and flew at the much more comfortable 25,000 feet, farther above the weather. It also held 90 passengers, more than double the Convair. Its engines were thirstier than the Convairs, but per passenger mile, it was much the more efficient ride. With the DC-7 and its predecessor, the DC-6, American could run transcontinental routes. But these were still run just like train routes. Just as many stops, but with longer hops. For example, San Francisco to Oklahoma City to Tulsa to Washington to Philadelphia to New York. The whole system was filled with inefficiencies. The railway-like routes ensured partially empty flights. The typical load factor, that is the percentage of seats filled, was just 60 to 70%, which is well lower than today's 80 to 90%. And they failed to utilize different types of planes to the best relative advantages. Now, these problems were hidden by the subsidies and the high fare prices. A ticket from LA to Dallas was $77.30, which was not coincidentally roughly the same price as a sleeper berth on a railroad, but much more than a coach ticket, and it's about $1,000 today. That was, in 1953, the typical person's month's rent, the down payment on a car, their electric bill for a year. The result was, even with the subsidies, few cities had service and few travelers could afford to fly. American Airlines carried just about 3 million passengers in 1953. Today, it flies about 200 million per year. And there is no getting out of the straitjacket. If you, as a passenger, wanted to travel from Indianapolis to New York, and you wanted the luxury and speed of the larger, faster, more comfortable airplane, instead of hopping to Cincinnati, to Charleston, to Elkins, to Washington, to New York, you could take one hop back to Chicago and from there directly to New York on the DC-7. but it would cost you extra, almost 50% more, from $33 to $49. Because to the Civil Aviation Board, all that mattered was the distance you rode the tracks. And so you were punished for backtracking back to Chicago. To the airlines, this meant that any thoughts of switching to the hub and spoke system were completely wasted. All this regulation was based on the assumption that airlines were, at their core, just railroads in the sky. Railroad regulation evolved to solve problems specific to that industry. Railroads required massive upfront investment to establish a route, and routes once established inspired even greater investments in the area, as farms and mills were built to take advantage of the presence of the railroad. This combination created captive markets which were easily exploited. The ICC's regulations kept the natural monopolies in check, yet had little impact on rail efficiency. After all, a train can always add or remove cars, and every station has its sidings. And trains had more flexibility in differentiating services. For its passengers, they could differentiate with sleeper cars, dining cars, club cars, and more. Prices for premium services that weren't set by the ICC and were the key to profitable passenger service. But those same types of regulations crippled the aviation industry. Aircraft can't change their capacity every time they reach an airport, so empty seats were unavoidable, both as the plane went from terminal to terminal and as demand shifted according to the day of the week and the season of the year. Aircraft can't add dining cars or lounges either. They could only offer so much in the way of amenities. In the 1950s, first class was actually a money loser. The extra amount they could charge didn't make up for the space that was lost and the extra staffing and supplies. They offered it mostly for a halo effect, to give the company some extra prestige. And to add insult to injury, the regulations solved problems that didn't exist. Compared to the investment required to build a railroad and put rolling stock on it, airlines are cheap and easy to get flying. You just need the airplanes, and oftentimes you can rent those. There's no track, and the stations, that is, the terminals, are very modest structures. This makes it pretty much impossible to maintain any sort of monopoly. Fare wars don't work. If a big airline tries to undercut a weaker competitor in an area, the victim can simply shift their airplanes to other routes. It's not like a railroad that has to abandon its track. And should an airline jack up rates to take advantage of a monopoly on a route or in a terminal, competitors can enter quickly to siphon off the extra profits. I should point out that today this is not always the case, but not because of lack of regulations of the airlines, but rather at some airports the supply of the gates is kept limited. Sometimes because of legitimate physical constraints on expansion, but more often because of political constraints, NIMBYism, and political players with vested interests in the status quo. Now, I'm not saying that no one has ever tried a fare war, but if it has ever worked at all, it has only been in the very short run. And the term fare war has usually just been a marketing gimmick. Sanity came in 1978 when the Civil Aviation Board was stripped of its powers to set routes and rates. For the first time in 40 years, airlines could, for the most part, set their own rates, set their own schedules. And it didn't take long for the map to change. In a matter of a few years, almost every airline switched to hub and spoke systems, and their networks exploded in size. Hub and spoke systems have two huge advantages. First, the service to any particular spot can be easily optimized. The airline can choose just the right airplane according to the distance and the passenger count, as opposed to the route system where every stop on the route shared the same plane. Not only that, but the airline can adjust the service frequency as well, much like a railroad can add and remove cars. These efficiencies have allowed airlines to cut the number of wasted seats by more than half. To put that efficiency in more relatable terms, imagine if your SUV magically started getting the same miles per gallon as your compact car. Second, adding additional spokes doesn't just add business to one route, it adds to every route. So the airlines are much more motivated to add service to marginal markets. In 1953, a couple towns like Douglas, Arizona, and Elkins, West Virginia had service, barely, one flight each direction each day, but they were the rare exceptions, the lucky recipients of expensive subsidies. Would you believe that Douglas, Arizona had service, But San Diego didn't? Now, San Diego didn't because, number one, it wasn't on the way to anywhere else. And even though it was the 31st largest city in the country, it just wasn't large enough to be a viable final destination. It's impossible to get accounts on how many more destinations are served today, let alone how many more flights. But we can get a sense of the magnitude of the expansion by looking at passenger counts. In 1953, American Airlines carried about 3 million passengers. In 2023, American carried over 200 million passengers. And in case you thought that hub and spoke systems would just benefit the big players, know this. Despite recent consolidations, the airline industry is actually less concentrated today than in the CAB era. American Airlines in particular has less market share than it had in 1953. The winner has been the consumer. We have more choices of destinations, more choices of flight times, and as for cost, remember that Dallas to LA ticket that cost $77 in 1953? A month's rent? It's actually a little cheaper today. Is there any other service for which that's true? The only thing that comes to my mind is the long distance telephone call. The map shows a fascinating story, the story of an assumption and how eliminating that one assumption changed an entire industry and really our entire society. A change almost as great as the building of our interstate highway system. Now that's great for collectibility, and there are collectors in this world that are looking for route maps just like this one. And this one is a particularly nice specimen. Note the color, and remember this is 1953. Most color printing was, as it is now, done using process color, that is, color produced through a matrix of tiny dots. Dots produced by 4 color plates inked in cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. But process color printing is inherently a little muddy, especially with thin magazine paper. This map is in spot color. No tiny dots merged together to simulate a particular color. Instead, each plate was fully inked in one specific color, chosen by American Airlines for maximum vividity and impact. Here we see a rich red, a deep blue, and a creamy gold, with black just for text and textures. The colors truly pop. In a magazine filled with dingy process color, these pages stood out like a diamond ring in a dollar store. And it's a beautifully designed advertisement, which adds to its value. Unfortunately, it was an advertisement. One printed in who knows how many magazines. Likely there were millions of these printed. And these magazines show up all over today. You can find them in flea markets, garage sales, online auctions, thrift shops, and maybe your grandma's attic. They can be purchased very cheaply. So this map is the opposite of rare, and therefore it will never be worth very much money. So I can't consider my purchase as a great investment per se, but I'm happy with my purchase all the same. So remember, like and subscribe and share, and check out the rest of our videos on the Eye of History.